What's up, guys? My name is Colin. I want to welcome you back to the Nicaea 3 YouTube channel, a place where we help you to think through the Bible theologically, via reason, and via the tradition of the church. Now, in today's video, what I want to chat about is I want to talk about God's omniscience, okay? And specifically, looking at how concepts of modern science, such as Einsteinian theory of relativity, can actually help give us insightful ways of an insightful lens to help think through some of the complexities of this particular topic. And it's also going to go back into the ancient world and touch upon the work of an ancient philosopher known as philosopher and Christian church father known as Boethius. So before we get started with that, though, I do want to give a plug. If you like the content of this channel, I would encourage a subscription, a like. Keep in mind those can really help the channel to grow in its infancy stages. Okay. Now, with that said, let's hop into the content specifically. Okay. Now, God's omniscience, okay, which is the study of how God is all-knowing. Okay, it's an extraordinarily important topic and concept, and one that I would argue really at the core actually can give us a larger framework and method of working through various theological topics. And actually, in so many ways, the way that we answer this particular question is going to be at the heart of so much of how we deal with various different elements of theology and various different doctrines, how we're going to work through those things, and some of the challenges that they present. Okay. Now, what I want to state off the top, okay, is I'm going to be speaking of various options on the table from a perspective of orthodoxy, okay? So a couple things I'm not going to be talking, so I'm going to be talking about the traditional notion that God from all time is knowledgeable about things, okay? And move from there, okay? I'm not going to be talking about, and I'm not even going to make a claim one way or the other on this, but I'm not going to be talking about open theism, which is the concept that God does not know what comes in the future. Rather, I'm going to be dealing with the more ancient ways of working through this, and then also how various movements in modern science can help give us a lens, or at least some cognitive space for how to work through some of these things. It can give us conceptual space, is the way I like to put it, for how to work through these various doctrines and what we're supposed to make of them. Okay, so God's omniscience is just a key attribute of God, right? It's listed in the Summa from St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's just one of the classical ways of understanding who God is, right? He's omnipotent, he's all-powerful, he's omnibenevolent, he's all good, he's also omniscient, all-knowing, okay? Now, the way that so many Christians will work through this, I would say, is based in the concept of what I'm going to call for the rest of this video a Newtonian framework of knowing space and time, okay? Newtonian meaning time was, time is, and time will be, okay? Meaning that in a Newtonian framework, time is a constant, and it was, it is, and it will be, okay? So many of the older arguments about God's omniscience, they are based off of this notion of physics, okay? When we look at like Calvinist and Arminian debates, all these various debates about what does God know and how does he know it, so often they're based around this basic premise that time was, time is, and time will be, okay? And I would say this kind of fits with some of the ancient church fathers talked about, or at least one of them I know of, I believe St. Augustine did, talked about God being timeless, okay? Or that kind of, the way I understand it, and I want to be fair, I can't quote a primary source here from St. Augustine, so I want to be fair to him. Again, somebody who is, he's canonized by the church and somebody I profoundly respect, so I will always want to, give him his due credence. But so I won't speak of his notion. I'm just going to speak of the notion of God being timeless. And when you base it off a Newtonian framework, what this can look like is you've kind of got time laid out here. Like I said, time was, time is, and time will be. And the way that God is envisioned is kind of that God is overlooking all of this at the same time. And so he can see into the past, he can see into the future. And you see, this is where so many of the doctrine, this is where so much of the Calvinistic type doctrine that comes out, it's coming from this lens, okay? I once heard James White talk about this. He gave this, he was talking about this, it was actually a Frank Turk debate where an atheist asked Frank Turek, he said, Frank, if God knew with 100% certainty in the Garden of Eden that Adam and Eve would eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, again, this is Newtonian framework. If God knew with 100% certainty that they would eat from this tree, then who really made that choice, God or Adam and Eve? And a hardcore Calvinist would probably answer, well, God did, but he was planning it all out for his glory in the future. Okay, that's one way that people answer this. And by the way, please don't let this question I presented be a stumbling block to your faith. There are absolutely good Christian answers to this, but it is something we're going to have to wrestle with as Christians, right? And in the video, then James White is kind of disagreeing with how Frank Turek responded, claiming it to be a form of Molinism. Okay. Now, I want to give a different framework of knowledge, though, a way of understanding this that actually comes from the ancient church father Boethius, okay? And what he talked about is he talked about it more so God's omniscience, again, not open theism, but more so being that time is real to God, okay? Meaning that in each and every moment of time, that God allows it to be real in and of itself. And so God knows because God is present in all time, but he also allows each individual moment of time to be real in and of itself, okay? Now, this is where I'm going to argue that just like, and I go on a little riff here, just as when Copernicus says, guess what? The Earth actually revolves around the sun, not the sun around the Earth. It's not a helio, or we're not a solar system that's based around the Earth, rather it's based around the sun. The concern theologically was, would this then put the Earth in less of a prime place within the cosmos? And what I would say is today, with the discovery of further studies in astrophysics, what we've come to knowledge of is that actually, in the sense of the teleological argument, it has complexified the need for a creator to allow this particular planetary system, and this particular planet in general that we live on, that God brought it to be in such a way that that we're not at the center of the universe actually makes it more so mathematically necessary. Well, how do I phrase this? It's always mathematically necessary. It's always necessary, of course. But what I'm saying is that just strictly mathematically, the chance of randomization is actually less possible because of the complexities of what we know about how dark matter works and just the various things that would be needed within a Big Bang cosmological framework to allow for human life to exist. And so the fact that the Earth is not at the center actually only pushes forward this notion of the beauty of a creator. Okay? In the same way, what I'm going to argue in this video is that Einsteinian physics, okay, and the theory of relativity, thus stating basically that time and space are not exactly constants, but that time and space actually bend with gravity itself. So it's not science fiction, for example, to say that if you're around a black hole and if we were able to do that and somebody went off on a spaceship towards the black hole and came back to the space station, that time would actually have elapsed differently for the people going towards the black hole and the people at the station, right? That's not just science fiction, that's actually real based off Einsteinian physics and what we know about it. And so if that is true in our modern world, that time and space actually bend with gravity, it makes a lot of sense of this theological notion that's very ancient, that God is actually present in each time and he allows time to be real in and of itself in each moment, okay? So you can see the profundity and the power of that actually when you really think about it, okay? Now, with that said as well, another thing that I want to argue specifically from that is that can help us make sense of various theological complexities, things that we've said since the beginning of time in the church were true, okay? Things such as the Mass being one, or the Eucharist all being one, that when we partake of the body and blood of Christ, we're going back to the cross, forward to the eschaton, and present with every saint's table throughout time. That becomes a lot more intelligible and understandable. It's always been intelligible, but you know what I mean. It gives us conceptual space for understanding when we have this notion of God as lets each time be real, and that time and space in our known universe actually bend around gravity. It just starts to make more sense of that notion. And so again, this is not saying it solves everything, but what it is saying, this can also deal with perhaps, and by the way, this is what ARCIC does in the Anglican Roman Catholic International Dialogue. Whether we're talking about something like Mary's Immaculate Conception, can grace go back, in the grace of baptism, go back in time to her conception, right? But this notion of space and time can actually help us work out a lot of theological complexities and help us make sense of various doctrines that we find ourselves in. And again, I say this as an Anglican, a high church Anglican, so certainly this notion of trying to find ecumenical consensus, and us being able to use modern science as a tool to help kind of again, it doesn't explain theology, but what it can do is it can help give us conceptual space for understanding theology. And I would argue that science is thinking the thoughts of God after he already thought them. So science doesn't need to be in competition with theology, rather it can be an aid, as long as we don't think of the world naturalistically, but we think of it biblically and theologically. It can actually be an aid from God to help us try to make sense of some of the natural world. That's a very Thomist thing to say, myself being a Thomist. But anyways, that's what I wanted to touch on in this video. I hope that, again, helps us give some concepts to think through some of these challenges. But again, I would argue that Boethius' model is correct. God allows all time to be real. In that way, God, it's a classical way of God understanding that God is truly omniscient. Time is also real in and of itself in each moment. So, for example, in the Garden of Eden, God allowed them to make real choice. Even though he was already in the future, so he knew what was going to happen, he allowed Adam and Eve to make a real choice. And they chose to disobey God. And so that's on them then, not on God. They made the choice, not God, in this model that I would argue for. And so that's just something to keep in mind. The way that we think about science can actually help us make sense of this and know that, yes, God knows the future, but God also only does what is good. And so then, people are still the ones choosing evil, not, you know what I mean? And God's always choosing the good in those types of things. And then his call is for us to choose good with him in each moment. So that's what we have for today. I pray you were blessed in it. I pray it gets your mind going. And anyways, I'll hope to explore some more topics like this in the near future, because I think this is actually a really interesting concept that can help us make sense of the various complexities that we find in the modern theological landscape. With that said, again, this is Colin with Nicaea 3. God bless you, my friends, and hope to see you in the next one. God's peace.